Thank you, Michael. Reverend Fathers and brothers, sisters, God bless us all, and may we have a very fruitful afternoon. What you see there is the symbol of a movement that took place in my country, in Romania, towards the end of the Second World War. And in the first years after the war, when Romania was conquered by the Russians, by the Soviets, and they installed their communist, atheistic dictatorship. What I'll be talking about is a very sensitive topic for any Romanian. If I get emotional, just take a break, switch off, and pretend you don't see it. The outlines of my talk, I'll give you a brief introduction into Romanian Christianity, because it's a branch of Christianity that not many people know of. Then the fact that there's a long established Theological, we call it in the Byzantine tradition, Theological movement, Theological spirituality, which means what? There's a strong tradition of what in the Orthodox milieu we call the Jesus prayer. A very interiorized form of mystical life, or mystical experience. Then I'll give you a few historical highlights of the context before the emergence of the burning bush movement, and of course, whatever I can about this wonderful movement that took place in my country. So about Romanian Christianity, although my nation wasn't called like this since forever, we have received this name quite late in our history. We have inhabited the same territory, north of Danube River, north of the Balkan Mountains, and whether you believe it or not, the ancestors of my people have received the gospel before we have been our people, Romanians. To the extent that some historians, perhaps moved by nationalist sentiments, have promoted the idea in mid-20th century that we are a historical miracle because we have been born Christian before we have become a nation. And there you go, there's a verse there from St. Paul's Colossians chapter 3 verse 11 where he speaks of the Scythians. The Scythians, well, that's a misleading term actually in the New Testament. The Scythians were partly my ancestors, and if you look at the map there, you see towards right corner, upper corner, Scythia Minor, which is the Roman name of, say, a quarter of my country. So the Scythians that have received the gospel in the apostolic century and have been mentioned by St. Paul in his letter are actually my ancestors. Not the great Scythia, which is above that area, north from the Black Sea. So that's what St. Paul speaks about. Then a few other things about Romanians. In late antiquity, so say the early Christian centuries, they were known to the various milieus around the Mediterranean basin. They were a Latin-speaking nation, and they were Christian. One of the peculiarities of my ancestors is the fact that they have never killed any apostle. All the all the martyrs that are known that have had something to do with that country or that territory were actually killed by the Goths when the Goths invaded my country. And that's very interesting. It shows that in reality the natives were already Christians, so they didn't have to kill anybody. But they are also known by many other reasons, or for many other reasons. Some of the bishops of that Roman province, Scythia Minor, were actually present at the first two ecumenical councils. Their names are recorded in history. The main metropolis in that area was Tomis, a city of Greek name, bearing a Greek name. What matters is the fact that there was a vibrant Christian culture already in, say, 3rd, 4th century. From that same area come various, well, maybe minor players in history, but not minor to my country, like for instance St. John Cassian. Although there's a lot of conversation about his origin, some historians today would propose that he was a Latin from nowadays Spain. There's a clear indication, and at least that's the traditional narrative, that St. John Cassian was from Scythia Minor, so from my country. Then in that's 4th century, late 4th century, early 5th century. Then towards the end of the 5th century, early 6th century, there's a group of monks from the same area called the Scythian monks. People that have anything to do with Byzantine history know about this group of monks, theologians, that intervened in the theological controversies of the time in Constantinople, and actually they had a very important role to play in at least the attempt of the Byzantines to offer a friendly hand to their confreres from Egypt, Armenia, Syria, and other places. Of course, as we know, it didn't happen, so we are still divided Orthodox. But what matters is the fact that at the time in Constantinople, what prevailed was a theological point made by my ancestors, who have advocated the position of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. So if you Google Scythian monks, 6th century, you'll find a few names. Their leader was John Maxentius. All these names are Latin, of course. And you see that the position that they advocated after Chalcedon was a Cyrillian position. Anyway, there's a lot of other things that can be shared, but there's no point in wasting your time. So I'll skip the modern part. History continues, and although Romanians have been in their history always under various foreign powers, it was a divided nation in 3 principalities. I am certain that you know of one of them, Transylvania. Certain you know of it. Okay. They have won their unity as a nation only towards the 19th century. Anyway, I move to the more interesting part, which is the fact that in my country, Christianity was always vibrantly spiritual, to the extent that we speak of a very strong philocalic tradition in my country. Philocalic, that's a Greek term which means originally a selection or collection of spiritual paradigms. Taking, for instance, you have the saints, so there's the fathers, there's the mothers. That's a philocalic collection. It's a selection of passages, stories, sayings of wisdom that can inspire, motivate a certain lifestyle, a spiritual lifestyle. And after those late antique beginnings, and I won't be going back to those famous monks I mentioned already, throughout the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages actually, literally in Romania, because Romania was at the time conquered by waves of barbarian nations. After the Goths, the Slavs, Bulgarians, Huns, Hungarians, and so on and so forth, Turks, Tatars, Russians, Poles, and so on and so forth. There isn't, at least in the Middle Ages, there isn't much evidence in terms of epigraphic evidence, so there's no writing. Barely a few inscriptions, but there are monastic settlements and hermitages in remote places, in the mountains and so forth. So there was a vibrant monastic ascetic tradition in my country that has never disappeared, and it's documented archaeologically. Then in the 14th century there's a very interesting moment there. The holy mountain Athos. There is there a revolution unfolding. There's a revival of the Byzantine spirituality in the form of what we know in history as the classical form of hesychasm, from the Greek word ησυχία, which means serenity, peace. Seeking peace was from the outset the goal of Christians. If you just look at the blessing that a bishop or a priest gives to the congregation in the liturgy, the priest says, "Peace be with you." So we are seekers of peace. And at the end of the liturgy, the same bishop or priest or celebrant says, "Go in peace." So we are peace seekers. In other words, when I say this 14th century classical movement of hesychasm is really an articulation of an otherwise deeply, profoundly Christian phenomenon. We are seekers of peace. What do we learn from these monks of the 14th century? For instance, the fact that peace isn't something that you can acquire by decrees or laws or something. Peace comes from within, and only after a lot of spiritual toil. Yeah? So this is what happens in the 14th century, and it's all related to the praxis, or the generalization of the praxis of what I mentioned earlier, the so-called Jesus prayer, which is something that I am certain everyone knows: "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." So that's the brief prayer that is repeated continuously, or as much as the mind doesn't explode, and that's a way of seeking peace through focusing on the sacred name of the Lord. Well, one of the 14th century Athonite hesychasts, Saint Gregory of Sinai, so originally he was a monk in Sinai, left the Holy Mountain because of the Turkish raids and found refuge towards the Danube River, south from Danube River in nowadays Bulgaria. There he founded monasteries. There are thousands of monks. This shows a vibrant Christian culture. You cannot have hundreds and thousands of monks without a vibrant Christian culture. And again, because of the pressures of the Turks, some of them crossed the Danube River to the north in my country. Some of them founded monastic settlements in my country. Some of them fled even far into the north, nowadays Ukraine and Russia. One of the disciples of Saint Gregory of Sinai, Saint Nicodemus of Tismana — Tismana is a place in my country — was one of the first hesychasts from the Holy Mountain, establishing monasteries in my country according to the Athonite rule. So that's 14th century, long before the so-called Slavic hesychasm. The first Slavic hesychast saint that we know of, at least, is Saint Nil Sorski in the 15th century. And in the 15th century, already in my country, the hesychast tradition, the tradition of seeking peace through prayer and ascetic discipline, has become so general that the Romanians, with their funny way of twisting names, they have transformed the word isichastis, that's the hesychast person. or Isihasterion, that's the place, the monastery or the hermitage where you seek peace. They have transformed it, but they have adopted it. So in my country, the word for such a monastery or a monastic settlement that is dedicated to seeking peace is called Sihastria, from Isihasterion. And the word Isihastis, Hesychast, the seeker of peace, has become in Romanian Sihastru. So that's already a term that is attested in documents in the 15th century. One of the greatest princes of my country, who ruled over the eastern principality of Moldavia for most of the second half of the 15th century, Saint Stephen the Great, his spiritual father was one of these hesychasts, Daniel Sihastru, Daniel the Hesychast. Anyway, then I'll jump a bit, in the 18th century, very important, it's when Slavic monks, Russian monks, Ukrainian monks, and then Greek monks begin to seek documents and pictures of the hesychast life. Something happened because of the Turkish invasions and so on and so forth. There was a break in tradition, the hesychast tradition. And we see Saint Paisi Velichkovsky coming from nowadays Ukraine to Romania, seeking their guidance and texts. He found a hesychast teacher, Saint Basil of Poiana Mădului, it doesn't matter now, it's a monastery there, who was a hesychast saint, and also a writer of spiritual works. Because Saint Paisi wanted more documents, Saint Basil sent him to the Holy Mountain. There, Paisi worked for 15 years or so, collecting documents that were almost lost, forgotten by the church. So the main documents, if you like, the constitutions of the hesychast life. After him, like 10 years or so after him, arrived there two Greek seekers, Saint Nicodemus, now known as of the Holy Mountain, and Saint Macarius, Metropolitan of Corinth, also seeking such texts and guidance. According to Saint Nicodemus, there was no hesychast teacher at the time in the Holy Mountain, so they couldn't find anyone to teach them, actually, the ways of the hesychast life. But the Romanians had Saint Basil of Poiana Mădului at least. Anyway, what I want to say is the fact that Romania was still a vibrant place of spiritual devotion, and the revival of the hesychast tradition in the 18th century, towards the end of the 18th century, 19th century, actually started there. That's the unwritten story, or the unknown story to the other Christians, including Orthodox. And then we have, in the 20th century, a number of centers that are interested in the Theological life, translations from the Theological, the collection of spiritual works mainly from Byzantine sources. But Romanians have also given the first translation of the Theological in a modern language. It has remained in manuscript still. The manuscript is preserved. But one of the monks from the team of translators of Saint Paisi Velichkovsky at the end of the 18th century, alongside translating into Slavonic the Greek texts, translated them in Romanian. The manuscript was just recently digitized by the Romanian Academy, and I had something to do about it, because I told them to. Moving to the 20th century, just briefly, between the two world wars, there's a revival of culture, spirituality. It's a very strange time, a very confusing time. You know, Europe was dominated by nationalistic ideologies of all sorts, particularly the extreme right and so on and so forth. The extreme right was very strong in Romania too, like throughout Europe. But there's this group of people, Nae Ionescu was the leader. He was a professor, I think it's philosophy, in the University of Bucharest. And he was a very spiritual person. And around this person, now UNESCO gathered around a wide group of particularly young Christian intellectuals that wanted to rediscover the roots of their spirituality. And under the guidance of this lay person, this professor, they started a process that led to the Burning Group movement, I guess, to some extent. Another phenomenon was, the last line there, the so-called school of Peltiniș. Peltiniș is a monastery in Transylvania, where during the communist era found refuge. Of course, it was an illicit group, a group of philosophers, some of them disciples of Ionescu, and there they tried to escape the scourge of the atheist propaganda by translating into Romanian the works of Plato and commenting. So they have produced like 12 volumes of dialogues and commentaries on Plato. That was their form of resistance. And in between there is the Burning Bush group. Now, the icon that you are seeing there, it's painted by one of, well, the last surviving, I guess, or longer surviving members of the Burning Group Bush, Elder Sofian Boghiu, whom I had the privilege to meet when I was a seminarian. For some reason, I don't know, I always feared that man because I had the impression that he was looking into my soul, into my heart, and for some reason I always avoided him. I would always kiss his hand and run away, disappear, so that he doesn't read me. Yeah, he was a charismatic. At the time, he was a monk in the monastery where the Burning Bush group gathered, but later he has become the abbot of the monastery. He was also a painter. He died in 2002, I guess. And on his cross, in a monastic cemetery, on his cross it's written Father Sofian, the iconographer, the writer of icons. And this is an icon that he was commissioned to produce, to draw, to write by the members of the Burning Bush, and that's a metaphor of the Burning Bush. You know, the famous epiphany of theophany in Exodus chapter 3. Now, a few things about the Burning Bush group. It started in 1943, so that's still the Second World War, when the initiative of two people, a poet, Sandu Tudor, that's his writer's name, Alexander Theodorescu, actually, and Elder Benedict Ghiuș, who was at the time the abbot of the Monastery of Saint Anthimos, of All Saints in Bucharest. They organized a retreat somewhere in Moldavia, so that's very far from Bucharest. And this is where, for the first time, they went together, particularly monks and lay intellectuals, to pray together. It was a form of Western kind of spirituality. And even if you look at the name of the abbot of the monastery, Orthodox monastery in Bucharest, Benedict, yeah? That's a very Latin name, and it shows the say, ecumenical views of this group and the monks in Romania at the time. Benedict is a very Latin, very Catholic name. I met Elder Benedict in his late years. He was retired at the monastery outside Bucharest, and at the time he was working on the translation of the Synaxaria. It's the collection of the lives of the saints. He produced that actually without any hope that that translation can ever be printed, can ever be published, because at the time not many Christian books were published in the communist Romania. but he worked. He worked, and the book was published 95 or 96 or so after the fall of the communist regime. Anyway, so this started the whole thing. Sandu Tudor was a lay person, a poet and a journalist, actually. But the group grew, and towards the end of the war, it counted a number of tremendous intellectuals, lay persons, clergymen, monks. All of them were very educated. All of them were very educated. And there's no point in mentioning all those names there, but for instance, Paul Constantinescu, the second one, a composer, Nikifor Krajnik, a poet and theologian, Anton Dumitriu, philosopher, Ivan Kulygin, he was the first spiritual father, a Russian emigre, the first spiritual father of the group, a charismatic. When I say charismatic, I mean a man full of grace, who was able, like the saints of old, to impart grace on his disciples, and so on and so forth. Their activities consisted in weekly meetings for prayer. They would usually serve together the Vespers in the Church of All Saints Monastery, but they would also have private prayers, the members of the group. They would offer public lectures. Well, they were not very public because it was an illicit gathering anyway. But still, they had some people come in there, listen to them. But what was the most interesting part of their activity was the fact that they would gather not only for prayer, but also to listen to one another. For instance, one was a poet. Well, I just wrote a poem. I want to read it to you. And the person would receive feedback, spiritual and, say, critical. Members of the group have created tremendous literature, Christian literature, which was published far later than those times. The most successful of them was the composer Paul Constantinescu, who composed in 47, so that's right after the Second World War, and the communists were overpowering government and all that, and he composed a Christmas oratorium, which is a kind of Western piece of music, but it's the whole music is Byzantine, only arranged for, say, orchestra and choirs and all that. The end, well, most of them died in 56, killed. Anyway, I prepared a few passages from the farewell letter of Father John the Foreigner, or Stranger, the Russian priest that was their leader. Actually, I don't think I can read it. But what he says there is it's a confession of hope. They were all scattered now. They all had to abandon ship, to flee. Some of them were already arrested. We don't know about Father John, how he ended. There's a lot of stories. There's a narrative, semi-official, that says that he was deported to Siberia, and he died in a gulag. Other testimonies place him in the mountains of Romania as a hermit. But what matters is the fact that this man was like the apostles of old, full of grace, one that could read your heart, could read your thoughts, could read your soul, but one that was also able to impart, as I said earlier, to impart grace and the Holy Spirit on some of the close disciples who were themselves charismatics, and as I said earlier about Father Sofian, who was the same, like him, like Ivan. And I'm just reading the first lines of the letter, and so it's a time of persecution. Some of them were already killed. And the elder sends them this letter. Glory and thanks to the Lord, who at this very moment shows us his kindness. In persecution, that's the power of the gospel. Sorry, babes. I can't continue. But you'll see this because I'll upload somewhere. You'll find it. Anyway, moving to the other great figure of the group. Sandor Tudor, the former journalist and poet. He has become a monk after the war. And first, his first name as a monk was Agathon, and then he has chosen as a form of extreme hermit life another name, Daniel. That's the photo that was taken by the political police, the communist political police. That's in his folder that accused him of being a mystic. A mystic, that was his fault, a mystic. And he was now a monk, of course. And he died. He's one of what Romania is called these days the saints of the prisons. Yeah, I should have taken a different topic. And he left behind to his disciples notebooks, his diary, reflections. I was tempted to give you the Romanian thing and then to translate it. It would be too much for me. That's from his second notebook, which is entirely dedicated to prayer. So it's a whole, you keep a diary, keep a journal, but instead of, writing about your breakfast and you went to clip the nails of your cat and stuff like that, you reflect on prayer. And I translated from his second notebook this passage. True, God received prayer cannot be just a prayer, in other words, just words. Kneel and say a few things or read from the book. Cannot be just a prayer or what we understand and know as prayer. It is a greater and more overwhelming offering than prayer. To pray truly in spirit and truth means to unceasingly burn in God's glorious light. To unceasingly pray to God means to burn yourself up in all ways, in all manners, and in all the causes of your life, becoming flame and burn charcoal and fire for Him. The Lord is the Comforter. You must unceasingly burn, continuously consuming yourself for Him, passing through the entire will of your potential, thus fulfilling through your burning up the crown of God's fiery love. The holy and unceasing prayer cannot be just a chosen hour and moment for uttering certain words. The holy and unceasing prayer cannot be the uttering of a little and dry formula of certain words. Holy and true prayer cannot be just one's prayer. Why I have chosen this? It's because I sort of tried to focus initially in my talk on the so-called Jesus prayer, the Hesychast prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. What Father Daniel discovered is the fact that true prayer cannot be just this, the technique of repeating the words, breathe in, breathe out, some kind of Christian yoga and stuff like that, some pranayama, you know that, okay? It's more than that. One's whole life should become that. It's more like prayerfulness rather than prayer. Prayerfulness is a state of being, a state of living where your life is entirely exposed to God and to your neighbor. You don't hide. You don't put a mask on. You are truthful to God, truthful to your neighbor, truthful to yourself. What you see is what you get. But what you see is actually more than what I offer or most of us do in terms of offering to God. Yeah? A whole life dedicated to God. This doesn't mean we have to become ascetics of a monastic version of some but we have to be always mindful of God. That's the prayer that Father Daniel was talking about. And actually, just before this, he was giving a paraphrase from Evangelist Ponticus. He forgot the source. He didn't know who was he sort of quoting from. But that's Evangelist Ponticus. The one that prays only when one prays doesn't pray at all, something like that. So, true prayer cannot be reduced to the moments where you say the prayer. True prayer is something that sort of encompasses your entire life. And as a poet, because his ascetic and monastic vows have not annihilated his personality at all, he has remained a poet. He has composed the Akathist of the Burning Bush. The Akathist is a Byzantine form of prayer. I assume it's familiar to most Orthodox. And it's dedicated to the Mother of God, whom he identified with the burning bush in Exodus. You can see the main topics of the Burning Bush group, their main concerns, in this very first stanza of his Akathist, which is, I translated it in whatever prose, but it's a poem. Who is she, so white and pure like the dawn? She is the queen of prayer. She is prayer embodied. See, prayer embodied, the same thing what he said in the notebook. Yeah? You don't pray when you pray. You have to pray throughout your life as one prayerful life. Imperial lady and lady of the morning, the betrothed one to the comforter, the transformer of life. To you do we run, burning up, consumed by longing. Make us partakers of the holy mountain table, the famous hesychast symbol. Be for us shading and dew, you the shading of grace, so that our nature is renewed through abundant grace. And so shall we cry out with the whole of the creation in profound reverence. Rejoice, bride, who weaves unceasing prayer. See, the topics of the notebook transpire in this form of prayer. Well, we don't have time to listen to any part of Constantinescu's oratorium. That's almost the end. I found this on the internet, Wikipedia Commons. It's an anonymous diagram that reminds of the icon of the burning bush. Yeah, see the icon, and there's the diagram. It's anonymous. I don't know what it is. Well, I don't know who wrote it, who made it, but that's a very interesting form of meditating on the symbol and the message of the burning bush. If you see, it's all Romanian, so you won't be seeing anything. The upper corner is the eagle, the evangelist, yeah? Then the angel, down. Taurus, the bull, and the lion. Those are the four symbols of the evangelists, yeah? In tradition. And then you see art, religion, science, philosophy. So the burning bush, the message of the burning bush is amazingly encapsulated by this diagram, which shows that focused on that fiery core, you know, the fiery core. Omega, that's a symbol of Christ, the end of everything, the fulfillment of everything, the eschaton, the 8th day. Yeah? Around that is focused everything. Everything receives coherence. All things converge. Art, philosophy, religion, spirituality, science, everything makes sense when at the core of everything is Christ, surrounded by his mother, of course. The Burning Bush group was characterized by one of the younger members of the group, Metropolitan Antonio Plămădeală of Transylvania, as a phenomenon of attitude, both of spiritual resistance against communism. But I believe it's more than that. It's the crown of an entire Christian history of my people. And it's a movement that was deeply traditional, very ecumenical, and also a very creative movement. It's a complex synthesis of philocalic spirituality, the Jesus prayer, but not only that, cultural creativity, Christian faithfulness, and martyrdom. All of them suffered. If not prison, they died. If they didn't die, they were in prison. Those that were academics lost their jobs. They could never return to their universities and so on and so forth. And I believe that this is a very inspiring movement for all the Orthodox and all Christians today, because we are so intolerant towards one another, and we need to learn to love one another with the heart of the burning bush, and we need to learn that all things can be made new and better if we bring Christ back to the core of this culture, this society, our lives. Unfortunately, there isn't much for you to read, serious stuff. The only source that is credible about the burning bush was published in 2007 in the Greek Orthodox Theological Review. It's available online if you Google the title there, the Burning Bush Group and Father Andrei Skrima. It's a bit weak, the article, in terms of the story of the Burning Bush Group. It focused more on Andrei Skrima, who was the last survivor of the group. But it's still credible. By the way, at the end of this article, you'll find the translation of the letter of Father John the Stranger, or John the Foreigner, the leader of the group. And I would advise that you don't Google the Burning Bush group. I did this just yesterday, and everything that you find on the internet is corrupted, either by nationalistic propaganda or by Jewish propaganda. Now in Romania there's a huge kerfuffle about denouncing all these people, like the Burning Bush people and so on and so forth, as fascists and anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. Yes, when I was 15, I was anti-Semitic. Yeah? Where you don't throw dirt on the name of someone, an entire life, an end, a glorious end, just because when they were teenagers they would do this or that. Yeah. Anyway, so be mindful. I would rather want you to look for this one article rather than read anything else about the Burning Bush. That's it.